The readings this morning will be taken from John 12, verses 1 to 8, and Micah 6, verses 6 to 8. I will be reading from the King James Version, but you may follow along in the Pew Bibles at page 825 for John and 705 for Micah. John 12, verses 1 to 8. Then Jesus, 6 days before the Passover, came to Bethany, where Lazarus was which had been dead, whom he raised from the dead. There they made him a supper, and Martha served, but Lazarus was one of them that sat at the table with him. Then took Mary a pound of ointment of spikenard, very costly, and anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the odor of the ointment. Then saith one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, which should betray him, Why was not this ointment sold for 300 pence and given to the poor? This he said, not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief, and had the bag, and bare what was put therein. Then said Jesus, Let her alone. Against the day of my bearing has she kept this. For the poor always ye have with you, but me ye have not always. And Micah 6, 6 to 8. Wherewith shall I come before the Lord, and keep myself before God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves of a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, worth 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give him my firstborn for my transgressions, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He hath showed thee, O man, what is good. And what doth the Lord require of thee? But to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. May the Lord bless the reading of the most holy word.
Thank you, Don. It's nice to hear different versions on occasion. It reminds us of the similarities between the translations and yet hear things in a fresh and new way. This story of Mary anointing Jesus' feet is one that my colleagues are divided on. We were talking a number of years ago, some of us, about whether or not we like preaching it. And it was about 50-50. Because there are some things in it that cause challenge in terms of what to do with. But before we get to that, I want to start with the broader context. John, in telling this story, emphasizes so much to us that Lazarus, who had been dead and that Jesus had raised from the dead, is sitting with Jesus at the table. And this is really significant because all of chapter 11, the good chunk of chapter 11, deals with Jesus coming and finding his best friend Lazarus dead and raising him. And then it goes into the scribes and the Pharisees basically being in an uproar and a panic about the fact that Jesus had raised Lazarus from the dead, because, as you can imagine, that got a little bit of attention, right? If I started saying to you, hey, did you hear about the guy in the next town that raised that guy from the dead? We'd talk about it, right? And that story might spread like wildfire. So Jesus' reputation as a miracle worker, as someone who definitely wasn't just that guy from Nazareth, was increasing. And it is 6 days before the Passover, which is a huge holiday in Jerusalem and in the Jewish faith. And the priests are so worried about the increasing authority and power and reputation of Jesus that they spread the word that if anyone sees Jesus in Jerusalem at the Passover, they're to turn him in, right? And so there is speculation in the chapter before and in the passage immediately before and after these verses in John about whether or not Jesus will go to Jerusalem for Passover. And 1 week from Holy Week, when we know Jesus rides into where on a donkey? Jerusalem. We know that the answer ultimately is yes. Even though it is dangerous, Jesus goes into Jerusalem. And so it's in this context of an increasingly politically charged sensitive situation around Jesus that this story happens. And Mary and Martha and Lazarus are his nearest and dearest friends outside of the disciples. They show up. There are at least 3 to 4 stories that I can think of where they show up. And in the middle of this dinner, which would have been exclusively attended by men, the dinner that we know Martha will be serving, because in one of the other stories, it's always Martha who's fussing and worrying about the fact that food needs to be ready. And of course, Mary, who in that previous story isn't working, is doing something else, right? And so Mary comes and she puts this really expensive perfume and oil all over Jesus' feet and wipes it with her hair. An act of intimate closeness that would have been completely unacceptable in their time. A closeness of relationship that would have been unacceptable, and also an action that would have seemed very perplexing, because there are only 2 times in the Jewish life when you anoint someone: when they're becoming the king or the priest, or they're going to die or have died, right? And so there's this. The men are up, they're put out pretty significantly, some of them, because they don't understand what's going on, and that's fair. It's a very unusual thing. And so we see Judas, because at this point it's starting to always be Judas, raise the most objection. He basically says, what a waste of money. Why would you do that? You could give the money to the poor. But of course, Jesus points out, or John points out, that concern was fake. Ultimately, Judas wanted to pocket the money and spend it. And in the middle of all of this condemning her and why is she doing this, Jesus says this really strange thing that is ultimately why clergy get a little, and anyone leading Bible studies gets a little bit careful. You will always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. And the challenge is what to make of that verse. And where it gets tricky is that sometimes the way we interpret that verse, not necessarily us, but the church, sometimes the way that Christians have interpreted this verse has been very contrary to what the rest of the gospel of Christ demonstrates. I personally have heard this verse too many times used to justify apathy or inaction in the face of poverty. Well, the poor will always be with us. I mean, Jesus himself said so we don't need to do anything about that, right? Or I've heard it used to justify outrageous expenditures like $1 million additions to downtown churches in neighborhoods where no one can afford affordable housing, for example, because the poor are always going to be there. We can minister to them after our $1 million comfortable, sanctuary with theater seating gets built. I wish I was joking. And I've heard it used to criticize movements that work for systematic change. They're not really doing the gospel. They should just be preaching and evangelizing. The argument goes basically then, if Jesus says that we'll always have the poor with them, then it's more important for us to work for spiritual needs over tangible physical needs. One of the things I loved about you and continue to love about you, one of the reasons I wanted to come and be your minister is that you do not feel like that. So thank you for not embodying that. But we might hear that and we might interact with that reality, that there are people who think that care for the poor and service of anyone who lives in injustice is not the work of the church. And that simply isn't so. Because there are some trouble points with that interpretation. As you and I know, we cannot separate Jesus from the poor. He met tangible needs on a regular basis. He fed the 5,000. He healed people. There's a story in the gospel about Jesus meeting a man who had sat for 38 years beside a pool waiting to be healed, believing that if someone would just help him into the pool at Bethsaida, he could be healed. And for 38 years, that's almost my entire lifetime, no one helped him into that pool. And along comes Jesus and sees that need and says, basically, why aren't we doing anything about this? and heals the man. Jesus meets tangible needs in very real ways. And so we as a congregation and as individuals try to meet tangible needs in all of the ways that are presented to us. But Jesus, in his care for the poor and for the widow and for the sick and for the thirsty and the prisoner, in all of his care for others, Jesus does more than just meet tangible needs. He also challenges the way that things are. Just like God did through the Old Testament, he challenged the system, in that case of the religious elite, that kept people in those circumstances. He challenged the attitudes of apathy or selfishness or whatever it was that led people just to complicitly sit by and say, well, there's nothing we can really do. And that is a problem because Jesus himself tells us that when he comes at the end of the age, it is the ones who have fed and watered and clothed and visited and set free the oppressed that he will bring to be with him. And so the challenge becomes to think about how we do that in big and small ways. The other challenge that arises from that first interpretation of the poor you will always have with you is that the Greek can be read in two ways. Rather than taking it as an excuse not to do much because the poor will just always be with us, we can see it as a command to do something very particular. Now, I don't like to get out Greek grammar because, frankly, I hated it as a subject and it's tedious and boring, but it actually is really useful here, so bear with me. Basically, the word that they translate into have has two forms that are exactly the same, the indicative and the imperative. Now, the indicative indicates something or states it, right? Ruth is sitting in that pew is an indicative statement. Like you will always have the poor with you. It's a fact. There will be poor people with you, right? But the imperative expresses a command. So it's a command to do something like, Ruth, sit in that pew, please. Or have the poor with you, or keep the poor with you. And in this case, how we interpret what Jesus is saying is very different. Because Jesus isn't saying, let her do this because the poor, they'll always be here. You can do something with them later. I'm here now and I won't be forever. But instead what we can understand Jesus to be saying equally fairly is, I am going to be leaving you. Always keep the poor with you. Right? And that is a drastically different way of seeing it, but a very fair translation because they are exactly the same word to the letter. And so then that changes the entire story, right? Then the story becomes Jesus is having dinner with these important men, and Mary comes and she pours this ointment on his feet. Judas gets mad, says, that's a waste of money. Jesus says, leave her alone. I'm not going to be here forever. Keep the poor with you always. And so the question becomes, what do we do with that? How do we keep the poor with us always? This is a question that we talk about as a congregation in a variety of ways. It's a question that the session think about in a variety of ways. And it's a question I have some thoughts on. First, we make room, right? Beautiful this morning that when the girls arrived and they were hungry, the folks downstairs, one in particular, found ways, would you please just test this macaroni salad? I'm not sure these chips are fresh. Looking for ways to meet that tangible need and respect their dignity. We make room. We meet tangible needs. We challenge when things aren't right. We advocate. That is a word that can make us nervous. But a big part of how the church can serve our country, our world, our town is through advocacy. An advocate is someone who publicly supports or recommends change, or who takes the cause of another person on their behalf. Our Presbyterian Pacers, what a name. We're advocating for better care for people when they're dying through hospice, right? We share our opinion with our neighbors. We express the impetus, the push of the gospel wherever we can. We pray for change. We vote for change. And I'll never tell you how to do that because that's up to you. We write letters. We think of all kinds of things that we can do that accentuate and add to the tangible needs that we are already meeting and the ministry that we are already doing. Bonnie Sutherland and I were speaking recently, and she mentioned that the actions of Mary in this story can really be an example for all of us because she took a risk by giving a powerful outpouring of love and service in front of a group of men that she knew would disapprove. And her love and compassion was bigger than her concern for what others thought of her. We were saying that it would be fantastic if we as ministers and our congregations could be even more like Mary. And we know that this is something that matters to God far before Jesus comes and reveals it to us. We see in Micah 6:8 that we are called to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with our God. This very much echoes the summary that Jesus gives of the Old Testament. When they say, what is the greatest command in the Bible? He says, all of the law and the prophets, all of the Old Testament is summed up in love God and love your neighbor. And at the same time, the Old Testament tells us, walk humbly and attentively with God. Sometimes inequality and injustice, hunger, poverty, illness, sickness, death, all of these things feel like a foe that can't be defeated. Like the guy in the bottom, we want to give up. But if we just keep going, we get to those diamonds. Especially when we recognize that there are systems in place and values in place in our society that are often counter to the gospel. And it can feel like we are very small and there is very little that we can do. But Lent is a season that encourages us to dream and to imagine what can happen when new life and resurrection enter the world. And there is a time that can help us to imagine what we can do in addition to what we are already doing. When I was a kid, I didn't know very many people who celebrated Lent. It wasn't really a thing that my church did, but my grandparents did. And my grandma told me once that Lent, when she was a child, was pretty rough because it was the most dour and depressing time of the year because you just continually reminded yourself how wretched you were. But it doesn't have to be that way. Really, at its core, Lent is a time to prepare, to get ready for the events of Holy Week, to remember that there is a drama taking place above and beyond the systems of our world in which new life and resurrection happen. It's a time to stop and consider the state of our soul garden, where we have been, where God has taken us, is taking us, and how we have gotten there. And to acknowledge where growth has happened and where transformation has happened and where it still needs to continue to happen. It is almost impossible to continue growing and learning if we think we're doing everything perfectly, right? I mean, downright impossible. We may be doing things well. I know many of you are doing all kinds of things well, and maybe even most things well. But we also know that on this side of heaven, we're never doing everything just well or perfectly. There's always room for growth and transformation as we follow Christ. And Lent is a time for admitting that, but knowing that God still welcomes us. It's a time to admit that sometimes we aren't always the Christians that we have the potential to be. I'm not always. You're not always. Sometimes we don't do justice. Sometimes we do not love mercy. And sometimes we'd rather walk proudly with our God, thank you very much, because we are good Christians, instead of in humility. Sometimes we say to ourselves, poverty and justice will always be there, so I'm going to watch more Netflix. I'm going to have a nap. But an essential part of Lent is also asking what we can gain as we continue to live into and out of the reality of the resurrection. As we admit to God and to others and to ourselves the areas that we lack courage or that are complicit in allowing injustice to go unchallenged, or where we resent helping others, or think we're too busy or too old or too shy or whatever, as we admit and are honest about where we would like to continue to grow, the joy of Lent comes in knowing that through the love and grace of Jesus, we have another chance. We can, by the power of the Holy Spirit, become more courageous, become more energetic, become more confident of the difference that we can make on God's behalf through meeting tangible needs and advocating and acting for change. It's never too late, and you are never too old or too young to serve God through serving others. And the ways in which we can do this are countless. So as we approach Holy Week, let us remember anew what its purpose was: to defeat sin and death and to bring new life and wholeness. And let us be willing to be agents of these same things in the places God has put us, in small and in big ways. Amen.